What if I told you that some of the very land growing America's food, the backbone of our food supply, is increasingly not owned by family farmers, but by corporations and foreign investors? Not all of it, not even most of it yet, but the trend line is unmistakable. Today, I'm going to break down who really owns U.S. farmland. I want to look at how that's been changing and why it matters socially, economically, and even geopolitically. I'm Jonathan Arms, and this is episode 2 of the Seeking Veracity Podcast, The Shift in American Farmland. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've been doing well. I want to bring attention to something that's been on my mind for a while. I live in an area surrounded by farms. In that, I did research into some of the farms around me, who owns them, their history, and how much land they had. I found that a lot of these farms are owned by families well known in the community and have been for a long time. I picture farmland as family owned, and that's still largely true. In fact, according to Ag America, over 75% of U.S. farmland is owned by active or retired farmers, not corporations or investors. That land typically represents more than 80% of a farmer's total assets. Families are to the soil they steward. On the other side, I looked into corporations, the same basis as the families. What I found is that corporate and institutional owners, still a small slice of the total number of farms, account for a disproportionate share of production value. These, we'll call them entities, represent less than 3% of all farms. That's not bad, right? But they account for up to 14% of the total economic output of the United States agriculture. Corporations and institutional investors may be a number, but they operate at large, often controlling larger tracts of land and influencing how that land is used. What I mean is when land shifts from family stewardship to corporate asset, the decisions tilt toward maximizing financial return rather than prioritizing local community needs, sustainable soil care, or long-term generational stewardship. That's where the narrative begins to matter, not just for farmers, but for rural economies and national food security. It's not a national security threat if they're gaining something, if you know what I mean. So then I asked, what about foreign ownership? Now let's be precise with the numbers. According to the Farm Bureau, foreign investors owned about 45.85 million acres of U.S. farmland and forest land in 2023, 3 years ago, which is roughly 3.61 of all privately held agricultural land in the country. Now that might sound small, and statistically it is. However, it's important to look at the trend. Since 2012, foreign-owned acres have increased by about 21 million acres, an 85% jump in ownership. To visualize, that's an area roughly the size of the entire state of South Carolina, all under foreign-held agricultural or forest land. So while the total percentage remains under 4%, the rate of growth is significant and definitely worth public conversation. Before I break down why this all matters in the first place, let's circle back and take a look at the U.S. landscape so it's fresh on your mind. So, family farmers still dominate in sheer ownership. That's more than 75% of farmland is still in American hands. So, corporate investment ownership is still a small number of farms, but big in economic footprint. Foreign investors hold around 3.6% of U.S. agricultural land, but their holdings have jumped sharply over the last decade. So why does this matter in the first place? Now, agricultural land isn't just land. It's where food is grown, supply chains begin, and rural economies are rooted. These large investors or non-farm owners who accumulate land may lease it out to large-scale operations or focus on crops driven by global economy, prices or prioritize land that maximizes revenue. Think things like renewable energy leases, timber, or biomass. This shifts what gets grown and how, especially in regions where family farms once dominated the agricultural landscape. The USDA NIFA states family farmers often reinvest locally in things like hiring local labor, supporting Main Street businesses, or things like sustaining small towns. This is very unlike institutional owners who outsource operations or centralize profits, reducing the local circulation of wealth and, in the long run, changing the local economy. Though not all corporate ownership has negative effects, the community impact can be very different from that of generations rooted in a place. But again, this isn't all about corporate, though. Policymakers have expressed concerns about foreign ownership of farmland, and not primarily because of the percentage, but because of the potential implications for food supply and security infrastructure. Federal reporting laws like the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act track foreign acquisitions, but don't prohibit them. That's led to calls for some lawmakers to tighten oversight or require more transparency, and I'm with them. I personally don't think an increasingly foreign and corporate owned farming system is good for the US in the long run. Sure, it's a slow burn looking at the big picture, but we'll feel and are feeling it in the short term. Land prices are being pushed higher to push out the little guy. According to the 2022 USDA's Economic Research Service, 39% of family farmers don't own all of their land, they lease it. Rents go up, so crop diversity is reduced to chase profitability. And sadly, what it does is erode community connections, and I've seen this in my own area, and even goes to the extent of putting pressure on local banks. The bottom line is that family farmers still dominate ownership. Corporate and institutional players are not yet the majority, but increasingly visible in ownership patterns. Foreign holdings remain a small percentage of total land, yet have grown significantly over the last decade. So this isn't necessarily a crisis today, but it is a trend and one worth tracking and questioning. I want you to ask yourself, what happens when food land becomes a pure financial asset? And who decides crop choices in 10 or 20 years? What does it mean for rural culture, local economies, and national sovereignty? These are questions that take more than a quick thought, but they're worth asking, I promise. Stewardship isn't just about who owns the land. It's about who shapes the future of how that land feeds people and builds communities. My specific area has been attacked before, the land and local ecosystem reshaped. I'll put a link to an article where I write in depth about the big three of upstate South Carolina in the description. This is Seeking Veracity, not for outrage, but for clarity, context, and better questions. If this episode made you think, share it. If you disagree, please, let's discuss it. Truth doesn't fear transparency. I'll see you in the next one, and as always, stay blessed.